She braced a beam against her shoulder and walked it up the frost-silvered ridgepole, while the sawdust still clung to her hair. The rope burned her palms, the sky held its breath. Somewhere in the cottonwoods, a crow croaked like a hinge about to fail. She had started before dawn because the wind waited until daylight to turn mean. Boards lay stacked like fallen soldiers, hand-planed by a widow who had no one to steady the other end. Her name was Mara Flynn. Folks in town said it like a question, and then looked at the ground as if grief were catching. She kept to the edge of things, the mercantile only at closing, the church steps when the hymns had finished, the water pump at the far trough no one liked because it squealed. Her sleeves stayed rolled, her fingernails carried a dark half-moon of pitch, and her ring finger wore a pale indent where a band had rested until spring took it. The ridge ran north of the Thompson River, a skirt of grass and sage with granite bones that got close to the surface. Mara's claim was a notch cut into that skirt. The ground smelled of iron and wet root when she dug the post holes. The air smelled of snow coming. She measured twice, cut once, then cut again when the board mocked her. She said nothing out loud except numbers and prayers. By noon, the wind arrived with knives. It went after the tar paper, clawed under the edges, tried to make a flag of her work. Mara wrapped the paper tight, tacked quick, breathed through the hammer blows. Each strike sent a thud up her forearm into the small ache just below her elbow, where the doctor had said, "You should rest that." Resting had not built a cabin. Resting had not stopped men from looking at her land like it had already forgiven them. She climbed the ladder with a tin pail between her teeth, 3 nails gripped in her lips like a card cheat. When the pail slipped and clattered to the clay, she closed her eyes and waited for the world to quiet again before she went down for it. The world did not oblige. A horse snorted from the cottonwoods. The sound slid through the trees and into her bones, like a winter creek finding an old channel. Mara turned slow. A bay gelding stood half in shadow, steam drifting from its nostrils. The rider sat straight-backed, hat brim low, a coat the color of wet bark. He didn't speak. She didn't either. The wind spoke plenty, bulging the tar paper with breaths like lungs under thin skin. The rider dismounted without noise, as if the ground had agreed to meet his boots halfway. He looped the reins over a sapling and came into the clearing. Close now, he was all angles and quiet. The jaw with a nick like a crescent moon at the hinge, the eyes steady and grey-blue as the river under ice. He carried himself like a man who knew how to make a day obey him, but didn't brag about it. He took the hammer from where it had fallen near her foot and held it out. She reached. Their fingers touched, callus against callus, a dry rasp, then parted. He nodded once, a hello that didn't waste words. She waited, still nothing. He stepped to the ladder, tested the rails with a hand that looked like it could close around a horse's jaw and make the animal listen. Then he climbed. He didn't look back for permission. He just set the paper, smoothed it, and in 3 clean strokes drove the nails home exactly where the joists asked for them. Mara blinked at the speed, the steadiness. "You're on my land," she said, because a person had to say something that reminded the world of its edges. He glanced down. The corner of his mouth flexed as if that counted for a smile. "I am," he said. His voice surprised her, low, kept soft by habit. "Wind's taking what you mean to keep." "And you mean to stop it?" He didn't answer. He set more nails. The crow remarked on it from somewhere in the cottonwoods. The rope on the ridgepole hissed against wood. They worked like that until the light leaned away. She cut, he placed, she measured, he fixed. When her arms shook, he braced the beam with his shoulder and waited without impatience. When his sleeve snagged a splinter, she turned his forearm over in her hands and plucked it free with the tip of her knife. She felt him go still at the touch, but he didn't pull away. At dusk, They stood with their boots in the same rectangle of shadow and looked up at a roof that no longer fluttered. The cabin had a shape now that could be trusted. Not a dream, not a sketch in dirt, but corners that would argue for her when winter came. "Thank you," she said. He tipped his hat, a motion as economical as everything else about him. "I don't know your name." He seemed to consider whether names were necessary. "Calder Holt." His gaze flicked past her shoulder to the tree line. "You have a creek near?" "Half a mile. Down cut through ash." He nodded once, as if she'd confirmed something. "I'll bring you a hand pump tomorrow. The town looks at your well like a dry wish." Mara straightened. "I can't pay." "Didn't ask." He turned toward his horse. "Why help me?" There was more in the question. Why today? Why when others looked away? Why now, when she had finally decided to stop asking? Calder paused with a hand on the gelding's mane. The horse flicked an ear. Wind moved through grass like fingers combing a river. He didn't answer. He touched the brim of his hat and swung into the saddle. "Calder Holt!" she called after him. He stopped and looked back. "If you come tomorrow, bring nails. I'm near out." That corner of mouth thing again. "I know." He rode into the trees and let the forest close behind him. Alone again, Mara crouched by the stacked boards and pressed her cheek to the pine to feel its cold. She breathed sawdust until her head felt steady. The sky went from pewter to ink. Coyotes tried a song out on the far ridge. She set a small fire in a circle of stones, ate beans cold, drank creek water warm from her pocket. She lay down under the frame that would be her roof and listened to the night invent distances. She did not see the lanterns moving along the far fence line. She did not hear the low voices stitched to the wind, the ones that carried her name wrong on purpose. She did not know the men from the syndicate had already been told a widow was raising walls on ground they'd marked on a map with a red X, and that one of those men had a scar on his forearm in the shape of a nail, thin, silver, and very personal to her. Calder came each morning before the sun figured out where to sit. He moved like weather you could lean into. He spoke when speaking made work lighter and stayed quiet when quiet did the same. Days unspooled like rope off a saddle horn. They learned the rhythm of building together. He found her blade dull and set it right on a whetstone, each pull of steel along stone a whisper with a purpose. She found his coat torn at the shoulder and mended it, fingers nimble, thread clenched between teeth, while he pretended he had to stir the porridge. He set the foundation under the hearth, tapping stones until their hum dropped to a patient tone. She chinked the gaps, lime in her hair like snow. She laughed when the lime dust made him sneeze. The laugh escaped her before she could remember she wasn't using those anymore. Trust lowered itself like a bucket into deep water, hand over hand. She didn't say thank you as much because it began to feel like a promise instead of a debt. He left a sack of flour without comment. She left a row of clean-cut fence posts stacked where he'd see them. He took his hat off inside the frame, even though there wasn't a roof to require it. She never asked him why he'd come that first day. He never asked her why she lived like someone listening for a footstep. On the 7th morning, tracks crossed the low spot near the ash creek. Fresh. 3 horses, one with a stone bruise that made its left hind step fussy. Calder crouched to read the sign, fingers tracing the pressed crescents as if words might rise. Mara watched his eyes narrow, the way his jaw unlocked when he made a decision. "Riders?" she said. He stood, watching fences that don't belong to them. "Syndicate." The word had a weight in her mouth like a coin you don't want to spend but know you will. He didn't answer. He walked the fence line anyway, slow, as if slowness might teach the land something about patience. He found the top wire cut and twisted aside, a mean joke. He set it right. He set a second strand low, where a horse wouldn't see it until his chest touched surprise. He set a small bell on a bent nail so that if hands came in the dark, sound would run to the cabin ahead of them. That night he left before full dark and returned after it, leading a second horse with a bundle lashed across the saddle, a hand pump, shovels that didn't wobble, a tin of 1-inch nails. He set them by the doorframe that had begun to feel like a threshold even without a door. "You didn't have to," Mara said. He lifted a shoulder. "Water isn't a favor." He paused, then added, "Neither is a wall that keeps weather out." She meant to smile, and found, to her own suspicion, that she had. "You talk like fences have feelings." "They do, if you listen." The corner of his mouth again. It had started to feel like sunrise whenever it showed. He caught himself and glanced toward the creek. "You shouldn't go to town alone for a while." She tensed, the old brace in her shoulders returning like a habit. "Who in town?" "Men who like maps more than people." He looked at her then, fully. "And men who carry other men's debts like trophies." Her breath snagged, the scar on a forearm, the silver line like a nail, the way the word debt could make her ribs too tight. She set the kettle on the fire because her hands needed to do something that wasn't trembling. "Mara," he said. Saying her name sounded like he'd only practiced it in his head. "There's a choice coming, about standing or moving. I will stand with you, or move you, either way." She looked up. His face was as open as the high meadow after the first cut. She nodded once, because that was all her throat could manage without breaking. Snow arrived in an afternoon flurry that forgot to stop. They worked inside the skeleton of the house with their breaths puffing like small ghosts. She told him stories in pieces. A sister back east who wrote with ink that smelled of violets, a jar of buttons from her mother's dress she kept buried in a tin under the stoop. He told her almost nothing, but he listened, like listening counted as speech. On the day the stovepipe went in, she found him sitting on the step, hands open on his knees, watching the river the way a man watches a road he might have to take. "You can say no," she said, though she wasn't sure to what. "I took something from a man once," he said. "Something you can't hang back on a hook. He was your husband." Everything inside her shifted direction at once, like wheat when wind changes. She heard the river. She heard the small bell at the fence. She heard the heartbeat in her own ears. "You knew Liam?" Her husband's name had become a small thing she shelved out of reach just to get through. Calder's throat worked. "I wasn't the wind that took him. But I set the fence that turned the herd when it shouldn't have. The ground was wrong. The angle was wrong. The cattle ran blind. He went under hooves that should have been mine to stop." He didn't look away from the river. "I was working for Royal Syndicate then. I believed a thing about big men and big plans." He opened his left hand, a white line across the palm like frost. "When I tried to pull him up, a shoe caught me. That's mine to carry. I left the Syndicate that night. I haven't used more than 10 words in a row since." Mara sat. The step was cold through her skirt. Her hands found each other and held on. The stove ticked. The river said nothing helpful. "He died in a stampede," she whispered. "They said weather. They said chance. It was a man's decision, mine." The world narrowed to the space between them and the way breath fog held there. She could taste iron again, old and thin. She remembered Liam's boot with the mended heel, the way he had sung off-key when his hands were deep in dough. She remembered the letter with no return address that had arrived 2 weeks later with a $20 banknote and no words. She remembered the scar on a forearm in town a month after, silver, nail-shaped, when a man she didn't know reached for her arm and she jerked away from all men for the next season. "It wasn't you who sent the letter," she said. "No. Or reached for me in front of Draper's feed." His head snapped around. "Who?" "A man with a mouth like a mean dog." Her voice resumed its steadiness with effort. "Said my husband owed. Said a widow's land was just land with one less person arguing for it." Calder stood fast enough that the step thudded. His quiet had weight when it moved. Jex Rudd, he said, naming a cruelty without adornment. Royale's left hand. Silence settled, not empty, waiting. Mara watched him. He had placed himself in the light. He had placed his guilt in her hands without offense. She looked at the skeleton of the house that was beginning to feel like a body. She looked at the river and the fence bell and the mountain shadow sliding over both. "You came here to pay it back," she said. "I came because I couldn't carry it any longer where nobody could see it." He swallowed. "And because you started with your hands when everyone else started with their mouths." She reached and laid her palm flat over that white line on his. Her fingers shook in a small, stubborn way. "Then we'll finish with our hands, and if men come for what they think is theirs, we'll show them what is," he said, the two words a solid piece of wood between them. He exhaled. Some of the tightness in him set down. He sat again. After a minute, he said quietly, "I didn't save the letter. I burned everything from that life. I kept one thing." He turned his wrist. There, just above the pulse, was a second scar she hadn't seen. A circle nicked by a nail, a brand undone by a hot horseshoe. "They marked us with a ring. I cut mine with a wheel rim. It didn't change the past. It changed what I'd answer to." Mara nodded. Heat licked her cheeks from the small stove. "Eat," she said, because tenderness needed something to hold so it didn't spill. She put stew in bowls. He ate like a man learning how. When he finished, he took the bowls to the creek, washed them, set them upside down on the log to dry. He did it all without noise, the way everything had been with him since the first nail. By morning, men on horseback were moving along the river, their coats slick with new snow, their voices low and wrong, as a prayer spoken backward. They were searching every ranch within 50 miles, and they had a map with Mara's notch circled dark. The bell at the fence shimmered once, then whispered. They did not run, not right away. Calder closed his hand around the decision and felt it settle. "We stay," he said. "We finish. Then we choose the road." He and Mara moved through the cabin like breath through lungs. She packed what mattered into a grain sack. Her mother's tin of buttons, the letter with the 20 that hadn't bought as much as it cost, a scrap of the dress she'd married in, the knife that fit her palm like a truth. He set the pump while the ground still gave to the shovel. He hung the door. It swung without complaint and stopped square against the jamb, as if happy to be given a job. The first rider tested their fence at dusk. The bell spoke, and Calder was already moving. Shotgun leveled low, not to kill, but to suggest priorities. "Private," he said, one word. A post set hard. The rider's horse rolled an eye. The rider himself, a man with cheekbones that made his face look like a folding knife, smiled lazy. "All land is Royale's concern." Mara stepped up beside Calder. She did not stand behind him. "Then Royale is concerned with the wrong places." The man's gaze slid to her and stayed there too long. "I recollect you." His sleeve rode up when he shifted in the saddle. A scar like a nail winked above the glove. "Widow Flynn, debt outstanding." He looked at Calder as if measuring coals. "And Holt. They said you'd turned deaf. Guess you turned dumb." Calder's hands did not move. His eyes did. "Jex." One word. No ornament. Jex Rudd laughed without humor. "Paper says this notch runs inside Royale's purchase by a surveyor's beard. Paper says you two are building on a mistake." He leaned and hooked the fence wire with his glove, felt the low strand bite his palm, hissed, smiled again like the hiss had been what he wanted. "We'll be back with paper and fire." He turned his horse. The fence hummed in his leaving. Night came in a single steady pour. They set buckets by the door. They set the rifle by the window slit Calder had cut when he first stood in the frame and imagined worst cases. They talked softly without wasting words. "If they fire it?" she asked. "Dirt's ready to throw," he said. "Roof's wet." "If they bring paper?" His jaw worked. We bring bodies. Then, after a beat, I don't mean guns. I mean townspeople with eyes. Pastor, Draper, Earl who hates Royale because Royale underpaid him twice. Paper burns fast when read out loud. She nodded. We have one more thing. She touched her own chest, barely. We're not leaving what we built for men who've never held a hammer. They slept in turns by the embers. In her watch, snow softened the world into one long-held breath. In his, wolves called from the timber, and a star slid down the sky like a nail thrown from a moving wagon. At dawn, hooves. Many. Slow enough to say they wanted to be heard. Jex came first, 3 men behind and 2 flanking, all of them with coats that had seen better intentions. He held a roll of paper tied tidy with ribbon, like a gift for someone about to be disappointed. By order of Royal Syndicate, Jex read. Not very well, as if letters were slippery fish. Removal of structures raised in error on lands duly noted as belonging to the aforementioned company. Failure to comply. He looked up with pleased malice. You know the song. Mara lifted her chin. The wind found the hair at her temple and moved it with care. This land was Liam Flynn's. He filed before he died. The clerk lost the page because Royale bought him new boots. She took a second paper from her apron pocket and unfolded it. I walked to the capital and waited 3 days and slept on a bench. I found the index book myself. This is the copy, signed, duly. Her voice did not break. You can read it, if you can. Jex's smile thinned. He didn't reach for the paper. Boots don't lose pages, men do. Men get corrected. He flicked his gaze at Calder. You want to try and correct me? Calder's quiet deepened. I already did. Jex's eyes cut to the scar on Calder's wrist, recognition like a wet blade. You cut the ring off. Means you owe more. He spurred forward a half step, and the fence took his horse in the chest low. The animal surged and checked. Jex swore, mean and creative. Move the wire, or I move the man. No. Calder's voice didn't rise. It just set. You don't come in this way. Jex drew, casual as reaching for salt. The gun came up. The world funneled tight. Calder stepped, not back, but sideways, putting his shoulder between Jex and Mara. Jex fired. The shot cracked the morning. Calder jerked. Blood darkened his sleeve, a spreading flower that didn't ask permission. Mara was already moving. She threw the bucket of wet dirt into the air in front of them. The second shot hit mud and swore. She had the rifle in her hands from a place she'd already decided on 3 days ago. She did not think. She aimed low at the fence post on Jex's side and shot. The splintered wood snapped the wire free like a released bow. It sprang, caught Jex's horse across the knees. The animal went down with a sound like a door broken wrong. Chaos opened. Men shouted. Hooves scrambled. The fence bell became wild music. Short moments, sharp. Calder dragged Mara behind the stack of lumber. He bled. He kept moving. He reloaded with the economy of a life that had learned what mattered. Jex came up cursing, his gun lost, his mouth bloodied, his eye full of hate that had waited a long time to be used. He went for Mara because that would be the scar Calder would keep the rest of his days. Calder met him halfway. They hit the mud together. It was close, animal. Jex's hand found the hammer by bad luck for good. He swung. Calder took the blow on his forearm. Bone spoke. He didn't drop. Mara ran in. She said nothing because names waste time when blood is out. She drove her shoulder into Jex's ribs. He gasped. She took the hammer from his hand because she had built with it more than he'd ever built with anything. She didn't swing at his head. She swung at his wrist. The nail scar split. He screamed high and surprised. Calder's fist found the hinge of Jex's jaw. The man went slack. The others hadn't expected anyone to do anything but fold. 2 rode in and found the low wire on their own shins, and confidence left their seats in a hurry. The last three counted and decided paper wasn't worth dying for today. They backed their horses and tried to untangle dignity from stirrups. Mara turned to Calder. His face had gone the color of unbaked bread. The blood had soaked his sleeve to the elbow. She tore the cloth, pressed hard, felt the heat of him with the heel of her hand. "Stay," she said. "You stay." His mouth tried to make a shape and then did. "I will if you tell me." He tried to sit. He failed. She held him against the lumber and spoke to him the way you speak to a skittish horse in a storm. Low, steady. "I'm here. Listen to me. Hear me. I'm not leaving." The town came because sound carries news faster than riders, when that sound is a gun. Draper first, still in his apron, then Pastor with his coat wrong side out, then Earl with a face like a weathered wall that had decided which way to lean. They saw the paper in Jex's hand, and the blood on Calder's sleeve, and the fence wire singing, and they chose a side that had been waiting inside them to be chosen. "You bring that paper here," Draper said, plucking it from Jex's limp grip. He read well. He read loud. He looked up. "This ain't legal. This is a trick." He turned, put the paper in the stove, and watched it blacken. Pastor nodded like a benediction without words. Earl spat like punctuation. "Far as I see, this woman's building honest. This man's bleeding honest. Royal don't own what a hammer earns." Jex woke to the sound of his own future getting smaller. He tried to rise and found Earl's boot lightly on his wrist. Not cruel. Correct. "You ride," Earl said. "You tell Royal he's got less land than his maps, not more." They left like a mistake backed out of. Snow began again, delicate now. The fence bell went quiet, as if embarrassed for its earlier behavior. Mara held Calder's face in both hands and pressed her forehead to his. "Don't you go," she said, plain. His eyes opened to the color of the river after ice breaks. "I won't," he said. He added, "because the truth wanted air. I don't want to." They set his arm and stitched his shoulder under the cabin frame they had made together. Pastor's hands didn't shake. Mara's did, but only afterward, when she was washing the needle in boiling water and had nobody to be steady for. Days unfolded. Slow. Full. Calder worked one-handed, angry at first, then careful. Mara kept the pace for both of them. The door got its latch, the hearth got its first bread. She kissed him once when the bread rose right. It was not a promise, it was an answer. Spring kicked the creek free. The cabin learned how to hold warmth and let smoke go. The ridge wore new grass. Royal sent no more paper. Perhaps there are some fences, even maps on her, when enough eyes have seen them. In June, under a sky with more blue than a person can defend themselves against, Calder stood with his hand in Mara's and said the words a man says when he wants to make all his decisions in one direction. He didn't say many. He didn't need to. "I will carry what I broke," he said, in front of Pastor and Draper and the river, who minds everyone's business. "And I will build what we need." Mara smiled with her whole face for the first time since winter. "Then build with me." She didn't say wife. She didn't need to. The word was in the way her fingers didn't let go. Later, months later, in the lean gold of September, a cradle hung by quiet leather straps near the hearth. A shelf held her mother's tin of buttons and the legal copy of a claim that no ribbon could ever strangle again. Calder's ring, a simple iron band he'd made from a nail he heated and bent, sat warm against her skin where a pale indent used to be. Outside, the fence hummed in the wind, satisfied with the job. They ate at the rough-hewn table he'd planed until it shone like water turned to wood. After supper, they carried 2 chairs onto the small porch. The river said the thing it always says. The stars came on one by one the way lamps do when a town remembers itself. Mara leaned her head on his shoulder and felt the knot of his old scar under her cheek, like a promise that had learned how to live with itself. Together they watched the Thompson drift under dusk, the cabin breathing behind them, their fence drawing a careful line not to keep the world out, but to keep what they'd made held close. If this story moved your heart, if the sound of a hammer in winter or a quiet man finding his words felt like home, come ride with us again. Subscribe for more tales of forbidden courage, quiet partnerships and love that build slow as cabins and hold strong as Riverstone.